and welcome back to my channel. My name is Victoria, and in today's video I'm going to tell you what I learned querying two different books, one that I shelved and one that got me an agent. So let's get into it. So as I said, I queried two manuscripts. The first one I ended up shelving after 2 years, and the second one landed me an agent. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my process querying both of the books, what I changed from the first to the second, and what I learned, and hopefully hearing from my experience might help you guys as you seek to get an agent for yourself. I'm going to assume you kind of know how the process works in this video. If you would like to see a video on what querying is and why you even need a literary agent, definitely let me know in the comments, but I'm going to assume that you understand how traditional publishing works and dive in from there. So a small caveat before we start, there's always the possibility that my second book was just better or more marketable than my first one, and that's why I got the agent, and it has nothing to do with my actual querying process, but I did change my querying strategy from my first book to the second book and how I pitched the manuscripts, and so I'm going to talk about it from that perspective because there's obviously a lot that can be said on how to write a stronger manuscript or a more marketable concept in a manuscript. So that's not really just one video's worth of content. So this one in particular will focus on what you can do when your manuscript is done and it's the best it can be, what you can do during your querying process and your pitching process to help you land that agent. So let's talk about my first book. My first book that I queried was called Rose Evans and the Monster Hunters, and it was a young adult urban fantasy. I did a lot of research before I started, but something that I learned in the process is that no amount of research can really teach you as much as just diving in can. Of course, I don't recommend you just start querying without any concept of how things work. I do think you should research first, but all that to say, I don't think that the research alone was enough to truly prepare me in terms of how to pitch well. I actually made a video talking about that in more depth where I showed how learning stuff from research wasn't enough to help me execute well in my query, so definitely go watch that video. I'll link it below. But essentially, it was things to do with like, you know, show how your protagonist stands out. So in my first query, I thought that I was doing that, but then as I queried more, I learned that you actually need a lot more specificity than I was giving. So if you're wanting to hear more about the content of my query and how that improved, I would check out that video. This one is talking more about the querying strategy. The first thing I did when I started querying my first book was I sent out about 10 queries. I kind of had this idea that I would send them in batches. I'd heard that other authors had done it this way. And kind of the goal of that is you can send a kind of a test run with agents you know will respond quickly, who tend to respond to everyone, and you can kind of gauge how you're doing based on that first batch. So if you send 10 and nobody responds to you or they all reject you, you can kind of take stock and think, okay, I might need to tweak my query or my first pages before I continue querying further. So that's kind of a good strategy. I would still recommend that, but in my case when I started with 10, which I think now is too high. And secondly, I was very impatient. So I think my first request was maybe the fourth query or the fourth response I got from that first batch of 10. And so when I got that first full request in only 4 responses, I thought, okay, that's a 25% request rate. Like clearly this is gonna go really well. And so from then I just quickly sent out like a couple dozen more. Like I just really went for it. From one full request. This was a big mistake because that was the only full request that I got in all of those queries. And the real problem with that was my query was weak and my first pages were weak. I ended up rewriting both of those by the end of the querying process. And because I got impatient, I ended up wasting a query on like, I want to say upwards of 40 agents, including some of my absolute top choices. And I mean wasted in the sense of I sent them not my best work, and you can't re-query unless you massively overhaul your manuscript. So I don't mean wasted on them, I mean wasted an opportunity with them. So after that long period where I sent out probably upwards of 40 queries and didn't get any further requests other than that first one, that was the time when I took stock and regretted my choices, and I rewrote my first chapter. I had started with dialogue, which, you know, is kind of a big no-no. People always say, don't start with dialogue. We don't know who these characters are yet. We need to ground the reader in the character, and don't think you're the exception. Well, I was that that was like, I'm the exception. This is brilliant. How could I not start with this dialogue? Don't be like me, okay? Don't be like me. Anyway, so I completely rewrote that first scene, not the entire first chapter. It was just like the first 2 pages or so that it starts more in the character's head and it's not kind of breaking the conventional rules, allowing myself to have the humility to realize that I am not the exception. And I also rewrote my query. So like I said, I made a whole video talking about how I rewrote my query and why. So I'll link that below if you want to see that. At that point, I started getting a few more good responses and I started querying a lot more widely. At that point, I think I'd been at it for maybe a year or a year and a half. And I was starting to kind of feel a bit desperate, although I didn't really acknowledge that to myself. And so I sort of channeled that desperation as just sending it out to as many agents as possible because maybe one of them will like it. I just haven't found the one that will like it yet. And so in that sense, I didn't fully learn from my first mistake. And I continued to query very widely without continuing to revise. This meant I was querying people without that much knowledge of who they really were as an agent, which was kind of a problem on 2 points. The first being, if they had wanted to sign me, I would have had no knowledge of who they were. And so that would have been a whole other learning curve to figure out if I even wanted to work with them. Of course, that's a very optimistic problem to have. The real problem that I had was that I was just gambling anybody that represented young adult fantasy might want to read it. And so I didn't spend much time looking into their specific interests. YA fantasy is a very broad concept. There is so much and so many different kinds of books that fall into that category. Querying someone just because they represent your genre actually has nothing to do with whether your specific manuscript is a good fit for them. It's a good starting place, but you need more of a connection than that. So basically that meant I was getting so many rejections that probably had nothing to do with the quality of my writing, but a lot to do with the fact that I was just querying people that were not a good fit for my book. It also meant that I likely queried some smagents. Smagent is kind of a industry shorthand for a shady agent or a non-reputable agent. Alexa Dunn has done a lot of videos on this, and I think iWriterly has as well, so I would recommend checking out their videos. Smagents are not always scammers out to get you. Sometimes they're just agents that don't have the industry experience to do their job well. And because I was getting desperate and flinging queries willy-nilly, there were definitely some people on that list that I would not recommend anyone query. A lot of them were small agencies that popped out of nowhere and then shut down a few weeks later, which is always a red flag. Or people that, like I said, have no obvious connections in the industry. I will say, as a side note, if any agent ever asks you for money, that is immediately a red flag. Do not give them money, they're scamming you. Luckily, that didn't happen to me, but I definitely queried some agents who are no longer agents, which obviously can happen for reputable reasons. People don't like it, they want to find a new job or whatever. But in my case, it was people who just kind of started their own agency, called themselves an agent, and then quit a few weeks later. Not the best approach. Finally, because I was kind of in that desperate state where I just thought better to query widely to get my book in front of as many people as possible, I also started querying a bunch of small presses. Now, there's nothing wrong with small presses. I think that's an absolutely valid career path, and I don't mean that to say that that was some sort of like problem or you would only do that as a second choice. It's just that for me personally, that was a second choice because I wanted to go a different route. I wanted to try to get an agent first and have a book deal with a major publisher. Now, I'm not against small presses in the long run. It's just like for my debut, that was kind of where I wanted to start. And so the querying of the small presses was not done with the kind of thought out approach of I want to build a career in indie presses or small presses. And so I'm strategically crafting who I'm going to query and which places I want to start with and build up from there. It was just, oh, they're a small press that happened to publish books like mine, so we'll send it to them too. So in sum, my querying process lacked patience, lacked thought, and lacked impulse control. I ended up querying over 100 agents and other industry professionals that would accept a manuscript, and I had about a 10% request rate. So that's pretty small. In 100 and something people, that's like, I think I had maybe 11 manuscript requests. And most of those came at the end. So like I said in my other video, if you want to go watch it, in terms of how I fixed my query and changed my query, most of those full requests came at the very end of my querying process. For the first year or whatever, it was really just that first one that sparked my flinging queries willy-nilly. My experience and opinion at the time was definitely prioritizing persistence over strategy. I thought, well, if I just keep trying, eventually it only takes one. But I think that my persistence blinded me to the specificity that's actually required to connect with agents. So let's talk about my second book. What did I do differently when I queried for the second time? Well, first of all, if you haven't gathered, I queried way fewer people. That meant that I also researched them way more. This time I created an A, B, C, and D list in terms of agents I wanted to query. That was not a ranking based on who I thought was a better agent. I only queried agents this time that I thought were all good agents that I would be willing to work with. So the A, B, C, D ranking had nothing to do with their quality as a professional and much more to do with their speed in terms of responding to queries and the degree to which I thought that my book was what they were specifically looking for. There were some other factors in terms of like who was a newer or more established agent, but it wasn't like a question of I think that the more established agent is automatically better. I was also weighing factors of how much time they could personally give to me as an author and like I said, how quickly they would respond and what they were specifically looking for. So from there, I sent out in batches. So I started with the agents that were almost guaranteed to give me a response because their track record would show that they respond to everyone. Either they specify that on their website, or you can also look on this platform called Query Tracker, which I really found helpful, where you can keep track of who you're querying, and there's also a timeline function, so you can see where you are in the agent's queue based on other users of Query Tracker. So I can't show you exactly where you are, like it doesn't show everybody that's ever queried the agent because it's not run by the agent, but you can see everyone who's using Query Tracker where you are on the agent's timeline based on that. So you might see when you're guaranteed a response or if you're guaranteed a response. You can see their response rate. So all that to say, anybody that responded really, really fast became like the first batch that I would query. I would also send out a mix of like people that I thought were definitely like a really strong fit for my book. Like they had specified like I want obscure retellings and sapphic love stories. Then like, so that's like very much my book. So people where I was like, yes, that's definitely what they're looking for. And then people with the kind of more tenuous connections, I would send kind of both in the same batch of queries, particularly with agents that both responded quickly. So I could see kind of like, okay, when I know that there's a connection, am I getting the good feedback I expect? If it's kind of a more loose connection, am I still getting good feedback? Because that means that like the writing must be pretty strong. Those are kind of things I weighed. It's hard to like make an exact science of it, but I went in with more strategy this time. The two main takeaway points are that I made sure that everybody on my spreadsheet were people that I would actually want to work with, and I kept it small. So the A, B, and C, and D list each had like maybe in the 5 to 10 range of agents. I think what was helpful in shelving my first manuscript was realizing that shelving a manuscript is actually not the end of the world. Like, you write a new project, you move on, you survive, it's okay. And so actually learning that was very helpful because it meant that I was more comfortable only concocting a list of agents that was like, I think I had maybe 35 agents on the list, where when I started, that seemed like such a small amount. Like if I didn't get an agent and only 35 queries, like of course I should keep trying. But that time I learned, you know what, actually maybe it's better to just be specific. If I have to shelve this one too, that's fine. I've got other projects I'm working on. And this way I know that I'm querying quality agents and I know that I'm querying people that actually would be interested in representing my particular book. So my overall list, like I said, had maybe 30, 35 agents on it. But by the time I got my call, my offer of representation, I'd actually only queried 15. So I'll come to that in a minute, what I did in that context, because my offer came quite early on in my querying process. And by the end, I only ended up querying, I think, 26 agents. If I hadn't gotten that offer, I think I probably would have gone up to like the 35, maybe 40 agents. But like I said, I think I would not have gone beyond that this time. So this book kind of worked out a little bit differently. Like, I'm telling you about my querying strategy, but I actually had a bit of a querying history with this book before I actually implemented the querying strategy, because what essentially happened was I wrote this book in NaNoWriMo of 2019 and then edited it through 2020. And then on a whim, I did Pit Dark in the fall of 2020. And from that, I had 2 agent likes. And so even though I didn't really feel like the book was ready to be queried, I just queried those 2 agents. And one of them didn't respond, and then she ended up leaving the industry. So I'm not totally sure what happened there, but the other one requested the full manuscript in, I want to say like September or October of 2020. I can't fully remember, but it was the fall of 2020 when I had queried 2 agents and got a full request from the Pit Dark Twitter pitch contest. If you don't know what that is, I can make a video, but I think I actually did make a video talking about Twitter pitch contest before. Anyways, in January of 2021, the agent got back to me with a revise and resubmit request. Because I knew that this manuscript was not ready to be queried, it wasn't really disappointing. It was more exciting because I was thinking she would just reject it right away. And so I was like, oh, clearly there's something here. And now I have this industry professional who's given me all this great feedback, because I knew that I needed to edit it more, but I didn't exactly know what it needed. And so having an agent tell me exactly what it needed, and I just really resonated with all her feedback, and it just hit the nail on the head. I was like, okay, we got our work cut out for us. So that was January of 2021. And then because her feedback really got to the heart of the manuscript and character motivations, I needed to do a massive overhaul, which impacted the plot. So I think I spent 2 months just kind of mulling things over and doing more research, because my book is a contemporary fantasy Beowulf retelling, but it also involves like the early medieval period as a historical period. So I had to do more research into the time period and more research into Beowulf, like the original epic poem, which I have studied it multiple times. My undergrad is in early medieval history. I've taken some Old English courses. Anyway, so I had experience with it, but it had kind of been a while since I'd read it. So I reread a couple different versions of the story and kind of refreshed who these characters were in their original form, what their form was in my story, what commentary I'm offering on the original tale, and what I'm adapting, what I'm actually taking from it. So yeah, it was about 2 months of just kind of sitting with that, doing more research, and then like outlining where my book was gonna go from there, because I am an extensive outliner. That brings us to, I think, March. And then March, April, May, June, I wrote, took a little bit of time off. I can't remember why now, maybe it was band related stuff. And then spent the summer writing and editing. So in the fall of 2021, I finished my revision, and that was the time when I felt like, okay, I think I'm ready to start querying again. There were some things I wasn't totally sure about, but I felt like I had a much stronger book under my belt. I felt like the beginning was strong enough that it would be fine to start querying and at least see how it went, see how agents were responding to it. So that is when I came up with my querying plan, and where I actually implemented the ABCD list and the list of 35 agents that I had. So I sent my book to the agent that did the revise and resubmit request with me, and she said yes, she was still excited to see it back again and happy to read again, which is never necessarily a sure thing, because it had taken me 9 months by that point, so there's no for real guarantee that like an agent would still be interested. But anyway, she said she was delighted to see it again and was happy to reread. So gave that to her and then started my querying in earnest. Like I said, I received the offer. It was actually from the agent who gave me the revise and resubmit request. So she contacted me just before Christmas and said she wanted to set up a call for after the holidays. And so at that point I had only queried, I think, 16 agents. So when I got the offer of the call, I took that as a sign that I was going to get an offer of rep. You can't always do that, because sometimes agents will call you to do a revise and resubmit, and sometimes I've also heard agents call you to reject but still wanting to keep the dialogue open. I think that's more rare. But in my case, because I'd already done all of this work with the agent, I was assuming that she would offer, because I think it's pretty unheard of for them to want to do another revise and resubmit with you. Like at that point, if they still didn't think it was ready, I think they would just reject you. So I took that as a sign that I was going to get an offer, and then I just queried basically anybody left, because once you have an offer, like you've heard it on the call, you have, it depends, but usually like a week to 2 weeks to contact other agents and see if they want to offer as well. So I was like, okay, I'm gambling on the fact that I'm going to get an offer, so this is my chance to send out any last queries that I want. And there were a few, because like I said, this came very early on in my querying. I had only queried about 15 people, and so I was was like, okay, if there's anybody that I'm desperate to work with who hasn't seen it yet, now's my chance. So I ended up sending another 11. Like I said, I think I had upwards of another 20 on my list, but because the agent who was offering was someone that I really wanted to work with and I had already done all this work with, so I was really comfortable with her and would be happy to work with her, I didn't want to query anybody else that I felt like less happy about, if that makes sense. So I was like, there's no point in sending it to someone else when I know I would already pick this person over them. So I sent another 11, bring me to a total of I think maybe 26 or 27 queries. I was quite comfortable with this number because, like I said, 30 was kind of my goal when I started my new strategy. I thought 30 was a pretty comfortable number. Like I said, I might have gone a bit higher if I hadn't received the offer. And in this case, I was a bit under because I felt like I already had an agent that I wanted to work with. So I've kind of jumped the gun a little bit here by telling you how the story concludes, but I want to go back a little bit to before I got the offer of rep in terms of how I actually implemented my querying strategy. So in this case, I only sent out about 5 at a time and I was way more patient. So when I got my first request from those, I didn't immediately send out another 10. I waited and then decided whether I needed to tweak things or not, and I did actually end up rewriting my query after that first batch, even though I think I had 1 request in the first batch, maybe 2 in the second. But yes, I waited and I rewrote my query, and that was very beneficial because my request rate on this book was over 30%, which was much higher than my first book. It's obviously kind of hard to gauge what's like a good request rate because you hear of like some flashy authors getting like a 70 to 90% request rate and some getting 50. I've heard that 20 is a success. So my goal was 20 because last time I only had a 10% rate. But this time, by the end, I think I had 8 requests in 26 queries, which is about a 31% request rate. So that was kind of right on target for me. It was actually better than I was anticipating, so I was very pleased. Like I said, if you especially compare that to my first book when I queried that, and it was 11 in like 108 or something like that. So I almost reached the same amount of requests, but in only 26 queries. So that was really exciting. And I think that's because I targeted agents much more specifically. I think also, like I said at the beginning, my concept is a little bit stronger for this second one, but I definitely was much more strategic in how I went about it. Let's jump forward again to what happened when I sent out those 11 queries when I was thinking I'd get the offer. So I sent them out and it was before the holidays, so very few people responded. And then I got my offer of rep on January 4th in 2022. And so after having an amazing conversation with that agent, I then went and notified everyone else that had my book or that had a query. So I think that was about, I want to say 15 people. Some of those queries of the full 26 had already been closed because they had rejected me like months before. And then I think 3 or 4 people had my manuscript already when I had the offer. And then after I started notifying the agents I just queried that I received an offer, about half of those declined, saying they didn't have time to read it in the allotted period because I had 2 weeks to let the agent know whether I would accept or not. So basically they were like, thanks for the query, great concept, but no. I can't read a book in 2 weeks, which fair enough. And then I think there's 4 others that offered to read the manuscript in the 2 weeks. So that was where like the final chunk of my requests came from. From that, as the end of the 2 weeks approached, I think 90% of them got back to me saying they hadn't ended up having time to read it at all. So it was kind of hilarious. Like, I think only 2 agents of so I had what, the 8 requests? I think only 2 of those actually read it and said it wasn't for them, or actually they identified some pacing issues, which is my current agent who I signed with has also identified them. So that's something I clearly need to work on. But they were like, you know, it's too much editing for me, I'm gonna have to pass. And then like most of them were like, I didn't read it, sorry. Which again, fair enough, people are really busy. So when the 2 weeks came to the end, I just had the 1 offer from the agent I had already been working with. We had already been working together. She clearly loved my book. She was so nice on the phone. And yeah, that's the end of the story. I'm gonna make a video talking about like how I got my agent. This one was more like what I learned from querying. And so all that to say, I signed with Margaret Danko of Paper Overboard, which is an affiliate of the Irene Goodman agency, after sending 26 queries. which was so different from my first book when I spent 2 years sending 100 and something. So I'm gonna sum it all up for you. What did I learn querying 2 books? Well, first of all, you need to be patient. Don't just send like 30 to 50 queries because you got 1 request, because that 1 request doesn't mean anything, and you need to have patience. Secondly, you need to be much more strategic than I was when I queried my first book, and you need to plan your queries in advance. You should do it slowly, starting with small batches towards agents that you know will respond quickly so you can gauge how you're doing. And thirdly, you need to only query agents who you know you would want to work with and who you strongly suspect would want to work with you. I know what you're thinking. I'm delightful, everyone wants to work with me. That means I could query anyone. But no, it means you need to only query people where they have said specifically somewhere that they're looking for a book like yours. Sometimes that's not always possible. I find especially agents that are more established, maybe a bit older, don't post as much online, so it's kind of harder to figure out what they might want exactly. So in those cases, maybe it's okay to still query if you know that they're repping your genre, but I would definitely do a lot more research, reading into their interviews or their blogs, looking on more than just their website and manuscript wish list, unless they've tweeted that they want exactly your book. Put in a lot more work to find people who you can be confident are looking for your book, because otherwise you essentially waste a query and you build up rejections, which is hard on your self-esteem. Like, let's admit it, being rejected is hard, and you don't really need to set yourself up for receiving more of those than you already will in this industry. Yeah, so that would be my advice to you. Patience, strategy, and research. So all that to say, I'm so delighted to now say that I have an agent. I have an agent. And I hope that this helps you in your journey. Feel free to leave a comment below with things you're learning while querying, or if you have any ideas for future writing related videos, I would love to talk more about it. Again, I'm not an expert, but I love to share what I've learned and my experiences. So I think that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.